Just to back up a little bit, what did you write your thesis on when you were at the end of romance studies before this transition?
This may not come as a surprise after the way I've tackled film noir. Actually, this ended up being a key part of our noir study. Is once we decided that that films noir were really self-conscious, and that there was sort of a self-consciousness that was creating a narrative template that these films were following. The key then for academic press is to find a critical paradigm that convinces them of that. Our purpose was to say that in some ways it's enough to watch the films, not to decide what is or what isn't film noir, or what the style of film noir is, but to actually create a critical notion and a critical paradigm about film noir. You can actually turn to the films themselves. Why? Because these are films that read themselves, and therefore they're already articulating a kind of a stance about how they want to be read. But then you have to create an argument around that convinces an academic press that there's merit to the argument. And that's where my thesis came in. I actually had written on a mid-century French literary group called the Oulipo, which was an acronym for Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, or Workshop of Potential Literature. And this is a group of writers that writes under constraint. And they're very tongue-in-cheek. They're very self-conscious because a work written under constraint talks about that constraint. So I actually wrote my thesis almost entirely on a work called La Disparition, which is the disappearance, only it couldn't be translated that way in English because it's a roughly 300-page detective novel without the letter E. Which is even harder in French than it is in English, in that about 30% of the French vocabulary doesn't have the letter, or has the letter E, including almost all forms of the present tense of to be. So it's a real challenge. And it's a brilliant book. And the way it ends up being about the form of the book is that the missing letter is itself the cause of death. So it ends up being a reflection on transcendent knowledge and our inability to achieve transcendent knowledge in this lifetime. And at the very moment that people start to intuit a form like the letter E, they start to talk about it. It's kind of a round thing, and there's this extension that, and they drop dead. And so, I mean, that in itself is both funny and it's brilliant in its own way. The other thing that people always point out is that it's a fundamentally serious work in that the letter E is the only vowel you need in French to spell both the words mother and father. And he lost his father to the front lines and his mother to Auschwitz, the author George Perec. So it's simultaneously playful, profound, sad, and very, very humorous. And I became interested in the sorts of texts that he was referencing throughout that text to do exactly the same gesture that we're claiming for noir, which is he's always referencing things like Poe's The Purloined Letter, Henry James's The Figure in the Carpet, Moby Dick. I mean, these are not accidental choices. These are all books about some sign of transcendent knowledge that's always just kind of right beyond our comprehension, that either dives a little too deep or somehow gets lost in the overall fabric of the story. And so that was largely the argument that I'd made, is that texts that are consistently aware of their own literary form advance critical paradigms. And if the critic is not hip to that fact, then we'll sort of carelessly apply psychoanalytic readings or structuralist readings or other things of that sort without being hip to the fact that the deep punning structures of that book already anticipate our work as critics. And that's largely the argument we make around film noir. Is we're not saying that you have to read the way we're reading by any stretch of the imagination. We're just saying you better be hip to the fact that these films are self-referential, or you're going to assume your own work as a critic is more important than it really is, because these films have done it for you.
Another question over here.
Got a quick one. You said earlier that you like to show the film and you like to read the book in class. You like to bring them both together at the same time. Can you talk about why and what the benefit of that and what you hope to gain from it and what you hope they see?
Largely it's a question of understanding narrative structures, I think, because choices have to be made anytime you tell a story. And when you adapt something to the screen, you have to make choices. Mildred Pierce is a great example, and I was going to talk about this in the intro, but I can mention it briefly. You know, large portions of that book are excised for the film. And once that's done, you have to create an entirely different narrative framework for containing the story, or it wouldn't, you know, really hold together. So you have to create the murder plot, in a sense, to compensate for all the things that you've decided to eliminate. There is no murder in the book. I think when you do the adaptation after you do the reading of the novel, first of all, it's one way to bring young readers into the close study of literature, because a lot of kids are so visual and they really have not had to read a lot. So that's one thing, is it's enticing. But it's also a great way to get them to pay attention to how do you construct a narrative, and how can you tell essentially the same story but leave whole portions out, and how do you edit? How do you condense narratives? How do you expand narratives? And when you're having to do these two different media side by side, I think it makes people much more alert to that.
As an educator and as a parent of a 2-year-old who I know watches Sesame Street,
Yeah, occasionally.
what are your concerns about your children learning narrative from visual media as opposed to?
It's a great question. You know, I mean, there's a lot of really sophisticated visual narratives. I'm not somebody who is against, you know, learning narrative from visual media. It's the fractured visual media that bother me. It's the fact that as a culture, we're at a point now where we don't have the patience to watch a film even. It used to be we didn't have the patience to read the book. Now we don't have the patience to watch the film. We watch clips, and we compare them to other clips. And I worry about that continual fracturing of narrative. You get to a point where there's very little that can be said, or that people know how to say. I guess that's the tougher part. What I found was that increasingly when I was teaching, is that there were few people who could string together an argument of any sort. And that was discouraging. It was understandable. And as a parent, it's worrisome. I feel like my kid watches too much TV. Compared to most kids, she doesn't watch a lot of TV.
Yeah.
But the strange thing is, and Rich and I often joke about this, because he's, you know, a digital media professor, and he loves these things. He plays with this gadget. He embraces these things. I am probably the only cutting-edge podcasting Luddite that you'll ever meet. At heart, I don't actually like technology for the most part, and I'm a very cautious adapter, because I think that what technologies do is enable our natural tendencies towards lack of patience. And I think that that's human, and I think that it's difficult to create environments where you have sustained conversations and narratives. And I worry about, you know, media more than anything else for that. I mean, I love the democratizing effect of media. I love that certain things can be shared and can actually create a difference socially, but I worry about the fracturing and the fragmentation of stories. Because ultimately the narratives we tell are, you know, are everything. They're our cultural
How we relate
identity.
to each other.